Terry Thompson joining us this morning from Idaho Fish and Game. 5 minutes after 7 o'clock, and we're at 25 on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. Bill Colley, too, until 10 a.m. on Magic Valley this morning. And you can hold your questions or comments for a few minutes because Terry's got a preamble this morning. But no matter where I've turned the last few days, and of course, the television came out and talked to your folks as well.
Many TV stations.
There's been a lot of discussion going on about this, and it's just there's some culling going on of an elk herd. And I was going to jokingly open this segment saying that Terry took out a couple of herds on the way in this morning, but some people wouldn't understand the sarcasm to all of that, and so they would really. We don't want to start that one, but obviously there's been some heated issues going on with a project that Fish and Game was working on.
Yes, and good morning, Bill, and good morning, everybody. So, I just wanted to take some time this morning, right out of the starting blocks, to kind of address the Facebook post that went out over the weekend that implied that Fish and Game, because of a landowner complaint north of Shoshone, went out in a day, killed 172 elk. There's a picture associated with a Facebook post showing numerous elk quarters sitting on the processing deck out at Scarrow Meats in Jerome, and I would understand people getting upset if they took it at face value, but unfortunately, as is the case in social media these days, things get out there, get a life of their own, and not entirely based in fact. So I just wanted to take a couple minutes this morning and kind of let people know what actually happened, and then I'd be more than happy to take phone calls and questions after that.
Sure.
So people around here are very aware that we have, or wildlife does, encroach onto private lands and potentially damage or I just say damage crops. And so the department is mandated by law to work with landowners to try to minimize or eliminate those wildlife interactions on private land. And ultimately, if different actions, treatments, if you will, don't work, then ultimately we can go in and issue kill permits or depredation hunts. So we spend a tremendous amount of money every year on depredation claims where landowners do have documented damage to their crops. So we worked with the University of Idaho and a graduate student to look at methods or treatments that we as an agency, in cooperation with landowners, might use to discourage wildlife from going onto private property. And the focus of the research, even though we do get depredation claims from deer, pronghorn, moose, the focus of this research project was on elk. So the student went out, radio collared somewhere in the 70s. I'll say 75 because I don't know the exact number off the top of my head. We radio collared elk. We use those radio collared elk to allow us to track where those elk herds are. And in addition to radio calling elk, we worked with 5 landowners across 5 different game management units to basically to monitor those elk herds. And when they came on to those private properties, we knew they were there because of the radio collars. So I want to take a step back because there's the premise of the research was looking at 4 different treatments, if you will, that could be used. One of them is using what we call sharpshooters, which is with the goal of changing the herd the behavior of the herd. Another one is looking at fence designs to see if we can come up with better fences to exclude elk from crops. Another one was spraying a bad tasting substance on crops that would discourage foraging by wildlife on the crop. And then the fourth one was, and this one is specifically kind of focused on in the Magic Valley here, standing corn. When you get elk in standing corn, it is very difficult. I won't say impossible, but very difficult to get elk out. So one of the treatments was to see if we could use dogs to drive elk out of standing corn. So as I said, this research project focused on 5 different game management units. 32, which is over by Weiser, 44, which is north of Fairfield, 45, which is north of Glens Ferry, between Glens Ferry and Fairfield, 52, which is north of Gooding, and 52A, which is kind of north of Gooding, Shoshone, all the way up towards Arco. So over the course of 4 months, basically mid-July to early October, and I'm going to talk specifically about the sharpshooters here because that has relevance back to the Facebook post. We had department employees. The Facebook post talks about that we hired hunters to go in and shoot elk. Our sharpshooting team was made up entirely of Fish and Game employees and the graduate student. And because, and this is kind of an interesting thing, is elk depredating on crops historically would come in during the daytime. Well, they got hazed out by either the landowner, the department would get called, we'd go up. And when I say haze, it's basically using methods to drive them out of the field.
Right.
Sound, cracker shells, a number of any one of the different kind of things. But these elk are very smart, and they change their behavior to start coming into croplands at night. So now all of a sudden, because they realize that nobody's out at night, so they could come onto private property without getting harassed. So they come in at night, and then they learn to go back out, to some safe spot. One of the one of our biologists told me yesterday that sometimes they're moving 6 miles between their day area and the night foraging area. So anyway, we employed department staff to go out at night and do what we call sharpshooting, basically killing elk in an attempt to change behavior. So over the course of that 4 months, we had numerous, and I'm going to call every time that the crew went out a treatment. So during those treatments, sometimes no elk would get killed. The most that were ever killed was 7. When elk were put down, we immediately field dressed them. We had refrigerated trucks on site or trailers. So the care of the meat was actually probably much better than most of us when we go out hunting. And then we would at times hang on to quarters until we had enough to take it to the processor. The meat was then processed at Scarrow Meats there out of Jerome. It was then given to Idaho Hunters Feeding the Hungry, excuse me, and then Idaho Hunters Feeding the Hungry then distributed that meat out to area food pantries. So the meat ultimately ended up on tables of people who were in need of food, and this is a great source of protein for them. So over the course of that...
well, hold that thought. We'll take a short break, and we'll pick the story up in just a couple of minutes. We've got the Ag Report and the weather on the way. Terry Thompson joining us this morning from Idaho Fish and Game on News Radio 1310, KLIX and newsradio1310.com. We're at 25 at 7:15. Bill Colley with you on Magic Valley this morning. We're talking this morning, at least in the beginning of this hour, about an elk herd that was culled. Talking with Idaho Fish and Game, and of course this involved depredation. Terry Thompson joining us from Fish and Game. He's here until 8 o'clock this morning, 20 minutes after 7 o'clock. We're at 25. Bill Colley with you too on News Radio 1310, KLIX and newsradio1310.com. And you were just talking about how, as we got to the break at 7:15, that you had experienced marksmen from Fish and Game who went out, and this was a gradual program. It was not all at once. It was a gradual program. The meat was very well cared for, and it went to people who actually need it. And you were getting through some of the details of that, and it took place at night because elk, as you were pointing out, have decided that they know better, that they would
Sure.
get chased away in the day. They were coming back at night, and so at this stage of the game, I guess that there's still some public misperception out there
Yeah.
that something here is amiss.
Sure. Uh, and I can't remember if I actually gave the number, but the post said 172 elk were killed, but implied it was done in a single day. In actuality, we through the course of the summer and early fall, 206 elk were killed as part of this research project. Um, and I will absolutely understand people's feelings that 206 elk is a lot of elk. Absolutely, it's a lot of elk. But we have very healthy elk populations in southern Idaho. The probably the two um, elk zone management units that we have, which when I say an elk zone, it is typically a collection of game management units. But say up in the Pioneer Zone and the Smoky Bennett Zone, um, we could easily say we have 20,000 elk in the population up there between those two zones. And so, when we manage as an agency by populations, not by individual animals. So, in the scheme of the elk population, 206 elk is a in statistically very small number. But at the same time, I'm not trying to say that 206 is insignificant. It was, but at the same time, I think the long-term benefit of this research is going to be really good for private landowners. It's going to be good for hunters, and ultimately the agency too, because we're mandated by law to work with landowners on depredation.
Well, a couple of things strike my mind. If we were having tremendous flocks of birds suddenly come through farmland here, there'd be efforts to get rid of them, or locusts, or whatever else. So depredation, it doesn't matter. If you're up in North Idaho, they're complaining about grizzly bears and wolves attacking cattle and the like. They would want something done about that. But I think what this really comes down to is some people felt that perhaps it was their right to go out and take these elk, and that you got
Sure.
in their way.
Yeah, and again, I can understand how people would feel that way. But going back to one of my previous points, which was these elk had changed their behavior, and now they are on crops at night. Um, by law, it's illegal for hunters to go and shoot at night. Typically, that is I mean, it's an illegal activity. So, because of our role as the management agency and the the operations of the research project itself, um, we've we used our sharpshooters, and ultimately, it would have been a public safety issue if we would have just said, "Hey, anybody want to go out and shoot elk tonight?" And so, because with very small teams going out, we could have very targeted events, and we had no injuries, no bad situations this summer using our sharpshooters, and so that kind of helps reinforce that it was the right way to do it. Um, but um, I'll say, if you take that post at face value, yeah, I might be upset myself, but there is, as usually the case, a backstory that actually I think shows that this effort was good in the short term, but more importantly, it's going to be good for the long term in terms of how we manage our wildlife populations and work cooperatively with our landowners.
I have a message on the News Radio 1310 KLIX app, and the writer says, if of course he's pointing out, he said, that weather and other things drive herds into the valley and other areas. But he said, why not just increase the number of tags? And he said, number two, he said, I don't feel sorry for ranchers because the elk herds were here first.
Well, so that's two questions. So the first point is, why didn't we increase opportunity? Actually, we did. Over the last several years in the Pioneer Zone and the Smoky Bennett zones, those hunts for antlerless elk were controlled hunts, meaning, you have to go through the application process and get drawn to get a tag. Because of our elk populations in these two zones being above what we call an objective number. So if we have an elk management plan, and in that plan, it defines what our population parameters, what we're looking for optimally. We have a low number and a high number, and we are above objective. So in response to that, this last year we increased those tags for antlerless elk up to 2,500 tags. They were made available over the counter, so people didn't have to compete for them through the controlled hunt process. They did sell out in both zones. We don't know what the harvest success rate is yet. We'll know that March, April timeframe. So we did increase opportunity for folks to get out and try to harvest some of those elk, because we realized it's going to take several years of increased tags to get our population to come down. So to the other point about elk being here first, we have farmers, ranchers have been in the valley and throughout Idaho and the West for generations, and they have, in my opinion, the right to use the land that they own to make a living. So they're out there working hard, raising crops. That's their source of income, just like mine going to work every day behind a desk.
I've got about a minute or so before the break. We'll get a caller on. Caller, you got about 60 seconds. Then we'll get to that after the newscast. Go ahead.
All right, real quick, the game department, I think, is doing a great job. These things. I do disagree with the way that the department chose to do it. I mean, if you mandate draw tags across the state, why not set something up where you can draw for night draws and then require specific equipment that would allow a hunter to do it in a safe way? And then that's it. I'll hang up.
We got about 40 seconds. Nighttime draw tags. That would be a legislative decision.
Boy, that's my guess is that, you're going to have to go in and change law to make that happen. I think that would be a difficult argument to make, only from a standpoint of safety, because typically nighttime hunting is not associated with legitimate hunting techniques. I'm not going to say it's out of the question. I don't believe that is something that we have the ability to do as an agency. It would either be legislative or potentially commission action to make that happen.
We've got to get to a break. It's coming up on 7:30. Terry Thompson joining us this morning from Idaho Fish and Game. We're at 25. Bill Colley on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. One more half hour with Fish and Game this morning. And we actually do have some other topics to touch on as well.